One thing I've noticed about communist psychology is that they always try to appeal to one's idealism and never to one's true needs or well-being. For example, we have all been told we need to stop using gas stoves or cut down our carbon footprint or things of this sort for the sake of the environment. But nothing they ever suggest is actually good for the individual of the society. It is simply the psychological behavior you see as a result of the observation, often given by philosophers, that communism seeks the collective good and not the common good, as the common good takes into consideration the actual well-being of the citizenry, individual citizens, and not just a total what's going to be the most financially beneficial or economically beneficial for society. There's a certain amount of fuss being thrown about by the government wanting to take away our gas stoves or getting rid of fossil fuels and cars that burn them and things of that sort. And they're able to capitalize on, and capitalize the pun intended, on people's ignorance. This is yet another actual example that they do not care about what they claim, as in the case of the environment. Aside from the hypocrisy of many of the elites, who are talking about global climate change, they continue to fly around in their private jets with impunity, and many other people have pointed this out. But being a mechanic in my former life, and having worked on hordes of generators of all sizes, I can tell you right now, it does not matter how efficient of a generator you have. The energy requirements to generate electricity and push it down the lines to heat a set of coils to cook food is drastically higher than simply heating with gas. This is presuming, of course, because they want to push us all towards renewable energy sources or sources that are green by nature, but these have become notoriously unreliable. The carbon output but let's go back to the generator. The carbon output in an electric generator for heating is far more than it is just to use the gas directly for heat. So that being said, this just proves my point about communists. They always give you an excuse about their restrictions, but in the end, their goal is to reduce your standard of living. That's really the goal. They want to reduce your standard of living. It is literally in everything that they do. They always push things through a never-ending address of real problems. In other words, they always push things through without ever addressing the real issues with their agenda, because their real goal of control and crushing the economy and culture for the sake of power, that is, they have to reduce people's quality and standard of living. They have to crush them underfoot in order to get them to be, so they reduce their quality and standard of living drastically in order to subjugate them, to get them under control. And this is why, though, in the end, even though they say it's to help the environment, and that's why we can't have any more semi-trucks, or we have to own an electric car that's plugged into a grid and all that things, in the end, it's to reduce your standard of living so that you can be controlled. And that is always what communists do. Demons do the same thing. Demons oppress people, which is an attack of their externals, and their goal is to reduce your standard of living to make you weak so that they can get you under their subjection. It's the same psychology. One of the definitions that St. Thomas gives of tyranny is where the leader looks out for his own private good over the public good, rather than the good of the citizenry and things of this sort. And this is precisely what we're seeing that's starting to take over various forms of governments. And this is a key point, because it basically means that their goal, the communist goal, is to gain control. As I mentioned in the last segment, their goal is to gain control over the citizens. But this is actually a sign that their psychology is also diabolic in this sense. in the sense that demons never seek after the good of the person that they're attacking or that they're trying to claim they're helping or that they suggest they're helping. In the end, demons are really about basically controlling other people and getting it to the point where the use of those other people is for their benefit. So anytime demons get in control, it's really to serve themselves rather than the people that are under them. It's the same thing with communists. One of the things that communists do is that they appeal to people's optimism, and idealism. So what they'll do is they'll say, look, if we just get rid of private property, or if we just get rid of this or that, or if we, if the government basically takes over in the end. And they always argue the government's going to be this temporary thing, so we'll just use a little bit of government to get rid of private property and get everything in place. And then in the end, with no private property, there won't be any wars, there won't be any strife and things of this sort. And so what happens is it starts out with this idealism. So if you watch politicians or people in the public sector that are very strong communists, it always starts out when people kind of sign off on the communist ideals and ideology. When they first start out about it, you'll watch this, you can watch them, it's verifiable, you can use them as case studies. They'll start out very enthusiastic, they're very joyful, they're very optimistic, they're trying to tell people, look, if we just do this, this is what's going to happen. But then over the course of time, in order to do that, in order to get it to the point where there's no private property, you have to start stripping people of things. You have to basically start robbing them and stealing from them and overtaxing them and doing a variety of different things to suppress their ability to own anything. And as a result, it becomes very draconian and malicious. St. Thomas defines malice as seeking the lesser good over the greater good. And in this particular case, this is exactly what's happening. They're literally destroying the citizenry, the culture, and various things to suppress everything in order to install this ideal state, this utopia that they claim is going to actually occur. But in the process, you're stripping people of all these authentic goods, and you're destroying their ability to grow in virtue and the culture to grow in virtue and things of this sort through strife and all this. And so in the end, what communism ultimately ends up doing is it ends up becoming malicious. So when you watch these public persons who are overtly communist, they start enthusiastic, but over the course of time, because they have to put in these draconian measures, they become more and more malicious, and so in the end, they're just malicious people towards the end. Well, this is the same thing that you see actually with diabolic psychology. They put stuff into your mind, give you this elation, oh, this will be wonderful, but in the end, it just turns out very badly for you, and the demons become very malicious and very controlling in the process. This tells us something very important, though, that they sell people on this idealism in the beginning, just as demons do. In the beginning, it's all this, oh, you're going to get this pleasure, you're going to get this, and then, of course, when it's all said and done, all you do is feel guilty because you committed this sin, right? And this is exactly what you see with communists. But it tells you something about this whole area of Marxism/communism. Marx said that religion was the opium of the masses. In point in fact, communism is the opium of the masses. And the reason we know that is because opium is something that you give to somebody to deaden their intellectual ability to function or their senses of things because they're in pain. And so you give it to deaden them in order to make them feel better and so that they don't focus on the pain so much. But that's exactly what communism does. You feed somebody something, you feed them these ideas, they get this elation and think, oh, things will be wonderful. But in the end, it just as opium doesn't cause the healing or solve the problem, neither does communism, because communism has always ended up very badly. It starts out with this idealism and this elation and this idealism, so it is an opium of a sense of the masses, but in the end, the masses ended up with nothing. One of the principles or rules in the rules for radicals is hold your opposition to their moral standards, but you don't hold any yourself. You just, ends justify the means. And basically, this is one of the reasons, it's that principle, which is why we see the hypocrisy is the hallmark of, as I've mentioned in the past, is the hallmark of communists. And they don't even see the rationale behind why it's a problem for them. And in other words, because they're focused on, I'm going to achieve this end, I'm going to hold him to this, they're blind to the fact that they're just hypocrites, or they might know they're hypocrites. They might know it's hypocritical, but it doesn't really matter because ends justify the means. But if you hold them to a standard or try and hold them to the fact that they're hypocritical, that they become indignant because you have called their character into question. And that is precisely the difficulty. Just like demons worry about how they appear to other people, they do have a problem with what they used to call acceptation of persons or human respect. So do communists, right? They still have that attitude of worrying about what other people's perceptions is, not because they care about the perception so much, but because they know it can actually destroy their ability to get achieved what they want to get achieved. But they become indignant. And this is an indicator of a complete lack of humility, which again is also what we see with demons. Demons, you see this in session, when you start calling them out on their hypocrisy and what they're trying to accuse the person of that's possessed, even though the person may not be guilty of it, they become indignant and irritated and tore up about the fact that you've actually done this because you've called their character into question. And this is ultimately rooted in pride. When their hypocrisy is pointed out, they seek to personally attack the person. This is exactly what you see with communists as well. That as soon as you call out their hypocrisy or show that they're not adhering to legitimate moral standards that everybody knows, they'll attack you which is just ad hominem, rather than actually address the issue. This is a key indicator. We have to be consistent in knowing that they're going to attack us. Just like any other abuser, you ignore their abuse, you ignore their attack, and you go after the root of the problem, which is their hypocrisy. In other words, before you can address their argument, you first have to make it clear that they're being hypocritical and that is not supportive of their position. And this is very often of the fact that they don't want to reflect upon their own behavior and their own shamelessness. This is because they use pointing out the problem precisely as an attack on you, who they view as their enemy. And so once you point out that hypocrisy, be prepared because they're going to go back on the attack. It's the same thing with demons. The minute you point out their hypocrisy or point out that what they're accusing you of is what they're actually guilty of, or that they actually have this particular character flaw, then they're going to attack you rather than actually looking at their own character flaw. One of the reasons that demons actually attack people psychologically and try to make themselves feel bad about themselves or drive attachments or drive vices is because in that process it weakens the individual and they can't fight back as much. This is what we see with communism. So if you go to various communist countries, they contract the food supply, which we're starting to see even in our own country, but they contract this food supply, but then they multiply the availability of things that drive vices and weakness, such as marijuana, or in some communist countries, you'll see they won't have any food on the shelves, but you can go to a liquor store and it's completely packed with all different kinds of alcohol. And I'm not against drinking alcohol, obviously, but it's just one of those things that you see this same kind of a thing. Or they have abortion and pornography and all these things. Anything to weaken the citizenry morally and psychologically so that they're more easy to control and to subjugate and to basically get them under your tyranny. It's the exact same psychology you see with demons. They try and weaken the person morally because then in their weakness, the demons can more easily manipulate them. And so in this sense, communism and diabolic psychology are identical. I think one of the things that you see people a little shocked about or even appalled is the fact that the communists and even the various leaders, even in our own country, that are trying to push us towards that, appear to be lawless, amoral, and heartless. Well, this is just a sign of corruption, and it's a sign of immorality. But this is an indicator that, again, their psychology is the same as the Diabolic, who are also lawless or try and inspire lawlessness to us, and immoral and heartless. We are at the point where most people look at what's going on in our governments and we say to ourselves, we're not shocked by anything, right, that we see. In fact, we should be to the point where their behavior has shown us that we should expect these things and be shocked if they don't do those things that are lawless and amoral and heartless, instead of the other way around. In other words, there comes a certain point where you just have to realize, okay, this is what we're leaving. This is the reality of the situation. Communists always operate knowing that the normal, reasonable individual will always look for a reasonable explanation or rationale for why their government leaders are doing the things that they're doing. In other words, they just presume that, that they are, in fact, doing X, Y, and Z because that person thinks, or that particular government official thinks this is the best thing for our country. But when you look at it, communists are just simply irrational and don't care if it makes sense. In fact, they don't want it to make sense because they want you to feel gaslighted, because they want, and they even use gaslighting, and it's very clear they're using gaslighting, but they do it in such a way, in order, as I've mentioned before, but they do it in such a way precisely to weaken the people. And this is exactly what demons do. They suggest things that are irrational. And we can't expect the demons to act in a lawful and in a moral way. But this, again, is an indicator that their psychologies are the same. Communists always demonize and attack their opposition. And this is in order to get them destroyed and subjugated again so that they can be in the position of power. The demons do the same thing. But the thing I want to talk about, which I've mentioned before, but the thing I want to talk about now is the fact that this attack is what diverts people's attention very often. People get sucked in, so they get attacked, and then the person feels compelled to deny the attack, address the attack, and do things like that. And we have to stop doing that. What we need to do is that when communists, just as it is with demons, when the demons attack us, you don't deal with what they're attacking you on. You have to flee those things. Instead, what you do is you go after the demon. It's the same thing in relationship to communists. When they attack people publicly, the person who's being attacked needs to just slow it down and just say, have you always had a problem in attacking people? Have you always had this issue of not addressing the issue but just attacking your opponent? Have you always had this problem of not sticking to the issues and just attacking in order to try and get your way done? And if we shift that, then what it'll do is it'll stop that nonsense, and then the arguments can be properly addressed. It's the same thing. So communists who attack their opponents have the exact same psychology as demons in that process of attack. It's a diversionary thing. It's to get you off kilter rather than actually addressing it. And what you need to address first before any subject matter can be addressed that you're talking about is you have to address their problem, because that's what the real issue is. Once they attack you, it's not what they're attacking you with is the issue. It's the very fact that they do not have the moral character not to attack you. So that's what has to be addressed. One of the things that modern psychologists have sorted out is the fact that people who are traumatized, their emotional growth. Now, I actually talk about this in my book in Diabolic Influence. But in that book, I talk about the fact that psychologists discovered that when a person is traumatized, there's a set of psychological things that occur that stunt the individual at a specific time of their emotional development. So if a person is emotionally traumatized at the age of 6 or 7, even if they can function as an adult to some degree, they still behave like they're 6 or 7 emotionally when certain things arise or things that are connected to those things they were traumatized. They still act like they're 6 or 7, and that's because their growth stunts. And it's not until they heal from that trauma that they begin to mature or advance. In this book on diabolic influence, I also talk about it's not just trauma. It's also the fact that when people give themselves over to a particular kind of an emotion, like pleasure or delight in relationship to matters of the sixth or ninth commandments, or when they give themselves over, in this particular case with communists, to the elation of the idea that we would not have to have all this private property and responsibility, and we would be able to do everything would just be glorious, there wouldn't be any strife and war and all this. When they give themselves over to that, the age in which they do that, they become stunted emotionally at that age. I also talk about it in a book I just wrote recently on the limits of papal authority, talking about how the fact that those people of the in the church that were in their 20s and 30s during the time in which there was all these changes that were going on in the church became stunted with all the elation that they had. Or even after the Second World War, it stunted the emotional growth of a lot of those people. Okay. All that being said, one of the patterns that I've noticed with communists is that their emotional growth is stunted. I'm thinking of a particular female in the politics in the United States who you can tell she gave herself over to something at the age of 16, because she acts like she's 16. Even when she talks, her thinking patterns, her talking patterns, all of those are at the age of 16. But she really pushes communism very hard, and you can tell it's all connected to that kind of elation. But the reason I'm pointing this out is that communists become stunted in their emotional growth because they gave themselves over to the idea of elation that things are going to be fantastic. And then, as I mentioned, they become more malicious. But this means is that, again, this is again like diabolic psychology. A lot of times in session, demons behave in very immature ways. And it's because they gave themselves over to the idea of the delight of this idea that they wanted, of this perfection that they wanted, and rather than sacrificing themselves to God. But it tells you something very important, is that if people don't engage in things that are penitential, etc., they'll make everybody else be penitential. Demons will and communists will, but they themselves don't do the penance. But if they actually engage in some form of penance, then what will happen is, over the course of time, that begins to break down, that lack of maturation. They begin to mature. The reason I'm pointing this out, though, is that it's important to realize that we're basically dealing with immaturity on the side of communists, just as you do with demons when they behave like little children when they start losing control over the possession situation. And so this is the same kind of a psychology that you see, and it's because of the fact that because of their psychological state, because of this elation or what they gave themselves over to or the trauma or what have you, they're locked into a specific time frame. So just remember, a lot of times when it comes to communists and with demons, but when it comes to communists, you're just dealing with a bunch of people that are immature, ultimately. I mentioned this before, but just briefly. One of the signs of communism is always a contraction of your material well-being. And one of the things that you always see with communists is a retraction of the material well-being. So, and you see this even with demons, they're constantly trying to do this. But this is one of the reasons why you will always notice a pattern. You always notice this pattern in every communist regime is a contraction of the food supply. Another thing that you see among communists, in addition to the contraction of the food supply, is death. And this is demons. Christ himself said it about Lucifer. He said and Satan, he was a liar and a murderer from the beginning. Demons are bent on death, and it seems that communists seem to be too. They're willing to use literally the murder or the wiping out of hundreds of millions of people, such as in the case of Mao or some of these other people, but they're willing to wipe out hundreds of millions of people in order to achieve what they actually want or to maintain their power. And so one of the signs that you tend to see is an indicator that communism is, if you actually looked at a human governmental system which demons would derive themselves, it's communism. One of the signs that this is hell's governmental system is the fact that it always involves mass death. Another sign that communism has taken over is a loss of religious liberty. They'll let certain religions practice because it serves the state. You even see this in Russia, where they'll allow the Russian Orthodoxy to function because of the fact that it's subject to the state. And, of course, this is the irony, is they have no concept of separation of church and state, which, of course, the church herself has condemned, but for completely different reasons. But the point being is that there's always a loss of religious liberty. They're constantly trying to use the judicial system or what have you to reduce the religious liberty. Obviously, this is diabolic because demons don't want the one religion that they know is the true religion, which is Catholicism, to flourish and have full liberty and freedom within the world. And so very often you'll see that especially the Catholics are the ones, or Christians at least, are the ones that are getting chiseled away at whether they can actually function within a communist society, just as demons don't want anything that's Catholic to function. On the other hand, they will promote the idea that there is no God, right? Communists do, even though they might allow religion to occur. Usually that's just to develop the moral status of the citizenry, which we saw in Russia. They outlawed religion, but then at a certain point they realized, no, we actually need religion to help the citizenry become moral and therefore strong, because without religion, people tend to dissipate morally and then they're weak. And so they allowed this religion, but it has to be religion under their control. It's the same thing with the diabolic. But since there is no God or religion for communists in the true sense, for communists, the state and politics are their religion, because you're going to worship something because we have a natural inclination. So it's either going to be God in its authentic religion, or it's going to be politics, right? And you're going to put politics above religion. For demons, they made themselves the center of their religious choice. So they made themselves. And you see this even among communists. Communists set up the government to be worshipped, and you kind of see this, right? Just as we would say that ultimately children which are given to parents are ultimately belong to God, right? Even though the parents do have the natural law rights over the children, they ultimately belong to God. Communists will say things that ultimately the children belong to the state, right? So they're making the state into God. Just as demons set themselves up to be worshipped, so in the end, communists set up their state to be worshipped. One of the things that communists will immediately do is gain control over the means of information. Demons do the exact same thing, right? And so as a result of that, you see that they want to be able to control what people know in order to control them. But one of the things I've kind of noticed is, especially in the mainstream news media, but you also see this even in certain spokespeople for the government and things of this sort, is that they've basically prostituted their own minds in order to promote this thing or to serve those people that they're serving. It's not any different from a prostitute in the sense that a prostitute uses her body in order to make money for the guy that's in charge of her, the pimp or what have you, and so she's serving him in a certain sense, but she prostitutes her body. But many people in the mainstream news media who are willing to lie or to deceive or withhold information that the culture and the society needs to know, or that the people need to know, they withhold it and suppress that. They basically are willing to prostitute their minds. They're willing to literally get up there in front of a camera and say things that are completely contrary to the truth. And this is just mental prostitution in the end. But communists have no problem prostituting their own minds in order to achieve what they need to achieve. They're willing to lie even to themselves in order to get done what they want to get done. But they're also willing to prostitute other people in order to get done what they want to get done. If every news agency is saying something, and this is something that I've mentioned, if every single news agency is saying something, and they're all saying, and you know that it's not true, it's a sign that, again, the communism is kind of taken over in the sense that they're basically being controlled, not necessarily by certain people in the government, but they're kind of being controlled in a certain sense. And so it's highly likely that it's false, right? The fact that they're all saying it. Whereas if you get different opinions and stuff, or if they, or somebody wants to report something, and so you see different things being reported about it, or different points of view, when it's always the same exact view. Well, this is what demons do. They're always putting the same spin on it. Every single demon puts the same spin on it in order to get people to fall into this. If it is true, it is only repeated if it can cause damage. So demons only tell you something if it's true, if it's going to hurt you. It's the same thing with communists. And so one of the things that always to remember is that be prepared for the fact that when communism takes over, the mental prostitutes are going to be the people on the streets, so to speak, and they're the ones that are going to give you the information, because those are the only ones that the communists will allow to engage in that activity. One of the things that an exorcist will often observe is how masterful demons are at mental reservation. Now, a mental reservation is when you say something that's true, but it's vague enough, or it's not really answering the question, or things of this sort. And so, or you're using the terms in ways that are, that the listener is going to be deceived in relationship to. So the perfect example that is often given in the moral manuals was the Nazis come to your front door and they say, "Do you have any Jews in your house?" And you say, "I have no Jews here," referring to the here, meaning referring to on the porch, even though you might have them in your house. So this was the kind of the example that they would often give. And so the moralists say that you can legitimately use mental reservation provided there is sufficient cause for it, right? So in relationship, though, however, to communists, they too are just like demons. So demons use mental reservation all the time. The exorcist will command the demon to say, "Okay, what's the story here? Give me this piece of information." And then they'll tell you something that's true, but it deceives you, or you're not getting the whole story, okay? Communists do the exact same thing. Let me just give you a couple of examples, and you'll see this immediately. They'll say things like, they'll be asked by a politician, somebody who's in charge of the border or something like that, or that works at the border. They'll say, "Is the border under control? In your estimation, is the border under control?" And they'll say, "Yes, the border is under control." Or the person will ask, "Don't you think that this situation in relationship with the border is that it's out of control?" And they'll just say, "No, I think it's under control." But if you pay close attention, what do they mean by control? That what's going on in the border is exactly what they want. So it is under their control as to how it's happening, not in relationship to how we would understand it normally. And you see this consistently. They'll say something that if you stand back and say, is there a way that he could be telling the truth, but in a way where mental reservation is being used and it's being deceptive, or he's using the term in a different way? And this is something that you see consistently among communists. They constantly use mental reservation without a sufficient reason. Usually it's in an area where people have a right to know, but they use it all the time, and it's done in order to manipulate you and to control you. It's exactly what demons try to do in session. One of the sub-virtues or integral virtues to prudence, in other words, if you don't have this virtue, you're simply not going to have prudence, is memory. So if you don't remember the right things at the right time, you're just simply not going to act prudently. Well, one of the things that demons can do is they can block our lower faculties so that we don't remember the right things at the right time, because demons specifically want us to not remember the right things at the right time. Or they can put a perspective on something to jade our memories so that we actually have a false understanding of what's happened to us in our own personal history, so to speak. But this is exactly the same type of psychology that you see with communists. One of the first things they have to do is they have to destroy the culture. I'm going to talk probably a little bit more about that later, but they destroy the culture in order to undermine the people. But my point is this. One of the things they do is they want to make sure that there is cultural or historical amnesia. And that's why they tear down statues, they tear down the institutions, they get rid of things that would remind people of who and what they actually are. And then they reverse revise the history. They put in a completely different narrative in order to change this. This is the exact same behavior that demons do. They're constantly trying to jade people's perceptions of history, and that's why. And they actually blunt people's paying attention to the lessons of history, right? They'll get people focused on this or that rather than looking on, well, no, this is what history actually taught us, right? This is a key thing because it gives us an indicator that if a nation's identity, its culture, or its history are being blocked from being passed on to another generation, or it's being denied or revised, that's always a sign of communism. And in that sense, it's no different than the diabolic. One of the behaviors that you see among demons is the fact that they basically try and pit one person against another. This is always done, you see this in marriage, where they'll jade people's perceptions of each other in order to split people psychologically so that they can get them to go to divorce. This attitude of pitting one person against the other by affecting the perceptions of each other, we're seeing happen in our own country now, but you see it always happens in communist countries where they'll take a particular subgroup of the culture and use them to pit the culture, various people in the culture society against each other. And this is in order to capitalize on it, because once a culture becomes divided, then it's weak, and then, of course, you can manipulate it and control it. This is entirely the same type of diabolic behavior that you see among demons when they're trying to pit one person against another. Because demons have a hatred for God the Father, they have a hatred for anything that resembles true masculinity, because all fatherhood, which is an expression, which masculinity is an expression of fatherhood, all fatherhood is derived from God the Father, we read in Scripture. And as a result of that, demons have a particular hatred for masculinity. This is one, and also femininity, but for other reasons. This destruction of true masculinity is something the demons always try and achieve in a culture because it becomes weak. And once men stop being true fathers and true men, then the protection of women doesn't occur, the actual providence within the culture doesn't occur, the culture, the morals and everything, even the financial well-being and the quality of life begins to degrade as soon as that happens. Okay, so this destruction of true masculinity is a means of weakening the citizens in relationship to communism to control them. One of the first things they got to do is they have to tear down masculinity. This is one of the reasons why feminism, which came straight from, it was obviously percolating in the middle to late 1800s, but Lenin used it in order to start bludgeoning the Russian culture, and you see this even in our own culture. It wasn't until the communists arose that feminism even grew in this country. And if you look back at it, a lot of the feminists were actually connected to this, but this was all an attack on masculinity. It's also an attack on femininity, but that's a whole different topic. But it really boils down to the fact that they were attacking masculinity. And so this is one of the reasons why I always found it interesting. My father used to love watching the show Gunsmoke. And it occurred to me one day that the reason he liked it is because it was a true depiction of men as rational, emotionally balanced, and with common sense, right? That's what kept coming out over and over again in the process. Good men had common sense. Good men were rational. Good men were emotionally balanced and were willing to fight and even run the risk of dying in order to secure the good. This is what real men did. These were, in that sense. A person might be smart, but he wasn't a real man unless he had those qualities. Now, people are portrayed as the men are portrayed as silly, dumb, or super smart, and therefore, but not physically tough, right? So even if they're smart, they're like evil, right? So again, and also they're never portrayed as really intelligent in a normal, balanced way, and also physically tough. But even if they are smart, then they don't have any common sense, and so they're silly and stupid. Or they might be physically tough, but they don't have virtue. So they might be, really tough. They're a superhero, but they're fornicating on the side, that type of thing. I don't think people in Hollywood even know what true masculinity is. I don't even think they know what virtue is. I don't even think they know what the good is at this stage, a lot of them, because they're not capable of portraying it. But my point is that anytime you see communism using the media or communism in a place, you're going to see a degradation of masculinity within a culture, just as you do when demons have ascendancy within a culture. One of the things that we basically learned about the whole Epstein Island situation is that when someone is compromised, you can control them, right? And actually that's true not only in the civil affairs, this is also true even in the church. This is one of the reasons why certain people in the church authority structure actually like homosexuals and things of this sort in the priesthood, is because they're compromised, and therefore you can actually manipulate them and control them to some degree. So my basic point is that one of the signs of communism is using compromised people in positions of power to control them. Demons are constantly trying to compromise people morally or psychologically for the exact same reasons, because then you can manipulate them and control them. One of the things that you'll actually notice when you're doing sessions with demons or dealing with demons is that once you kind of catch on to them that something is going on, then what they'll do is they'll often create a distraction in order to get your mind off of the fact that you just saw them, and so you get hung up with the distraction, right? Well, communists do the same thing. So what they do is they create distractions in order to get people's focus off the fact that they're corrupt, or they've done something immoral, they're not doing something right in relationship to their governance or what have you, so they'll create a distraction, right? So, for example, one of the things we saw in this own country is that all sorts of things were starting to come to the surface about the politics in our country, and then the next thing you know, this balloon floats across the sky, and everyone's paying attention to the balloon, and they're all distracted, and all of a sudden now they're not talking about any of that. But this is one of the signs that you actually know that communist psychology and diabolic psychology is, very similar, in the sense that they both serve to create distractions in order to give excuses for the government to get more power very often, but also they do it in order to distract you from the problem. They create artificial crises in order to control people. And this can be everything from electrical blackouts to supply chain disruptions. It can be pretty much anything. And I'm not suggesting these things have been in the past, because I haven't studied them that closely. All I'm saying is that you'll see this pattern, that whenever demons get into control, or whenever communists get into control, all of a sudden, as the rot starts to surface, and once people start figuring things out, we start going through a series of distraction or things that occur. This is in order to shore up their power, to regain control over a situation which has gone bad for them. This is particularly true when you see it among demons. So this is just a warning that if you see a crisis or a problem is likely to happen once things start looking bad for the government or people in the government. And we have to be wise and prescient and be on the ball to know that this is what's going to happen. It's not only true among communists, but it's also true in your own spiritual life. You have to be prepared that once you start figuring out that there's something diabolic in your life that needs to be addressed, be prepared for the distractions. See if you notice this pattern, that you start getting lied to, and then there's all sorts of fraud and deception that begin to occur. And then once the deception and fraud begins to be discovered, and the intellectual argument on the side of those in the government, or even on the side of demons, once that's discovered, then because they're in a position of power, the only thing left is force. One of the things that demons do is that they will suggest to people that if they if you do this, and the demons will give you something in control, in relationship to that, and that ultimately the demons are trying to suggest something and trying to give you something. But once they get their foot in the door, once they've given that and you've given consent to that thing, or you've done what they wanted you to do, then once they've got their foot in the door, then they will attack you and bring you under control and under subjection. In other words, they use a suggestion of, you should do this or you should do that. And it's really to give them power. And then once they get the power, they become dictatorial in your life. This is the way demons function. This is the exact same thing that you see among communists. They call for revolution, they call for democracy, and then they'll get into positions where they gain control over the power. They talk about sharing power and that it's really bad, that if you want to hoard your power, this is really bad, so you have to give us some of your power. But once they get into positions of power, they become completely dictatorial. One of the things that you'll see by demons is that they're always trying to infiltrate someplace. They're trying to get into it. In other words, they never are capable of gaining people's trust, and they're not capable of really persuading people. I mean, they do use persuasion in the sense they put perspectives on certain things, but in the end, people will kind of like, yeah, that just isn't true. And so or they'll recognize there's something wrong with this because we have a natural law that tells us, this, I shouldn't be doing this. And so over the course of time, what will very often you'll see is that because demons can't persuade people to give them power, a lot of times they'll infiltrate a place. They get into it quietly. They go into a particular location. They get in there, and then you're like, how did they get in? And then you start to realize they started low, and then they worked their way up, etc. And this infiltration, because you cannot persuade, is the exact same psychology you see by communists. The point I'm driving out is that communism never persuades long term, because you start to see the deleterious effects on the culture, on the people, on everything. There's every single facet of the culture just starts to implode once communism fully takes over. And so they very often, because they can't really persuade people, especially in this country, of people who are actually knowledgeable. Now, they can brainwash people at first, but people who have actually lived a good, virtuous life in this country and have tried to be, diligent and industrious citizens for the good of our country and things of that sort, when they hear communism, it immediately doesn't persuade them. They're like, no, that's not going to work, and here's why. What communists have to do is they have to infiltrate, because they can't persuade. And then once they get in, then they control the sources of information, and then they don't let you give a counter argument, because they know that you're going to persuade people contrary to the way in which they do. But this is one of the reasons why very few people ultimately end up following communists. And in the end, if people truly knew that the demons were falsifying the information, or that they really couldn't do what they could do, then in other words, if people were aware of the fact that demons infiltrate precisely because they don't have the upper hand in the argument, they wouldn't buy it. So one of the patterns you'll see with demons in session is once you start beating them up and then you catch them in their lie and then you tell them, hey, you're lying, knock it off. Then what they'll do, so they try and push their lie, and they got caught doing something that's bad, and you call it out. Then the demons will often go into anger and screaming mode. Then the next thing they do is when that doesn't work and you tell them, knock it off, and suck it up and pay your price for having lied and done the wrong thing, then what they do is they go on the verbal attack. So then they start attacking you and saying bad things against you, etc. And this is the same type of thing that you see in our own country as it becomes more and more communist. It's like living in the situation here in the U.S., in the sense that it's like living in a house with a 16-year-old who has gotten caught lying and doing bad things. Her lies are called out, and then she goes into screaming mode, and then that doesn't work, so she verbally attacks her parents for hating her. And this is the division this is a diversion from the real issue, which is she was lying and she got caught, right? And it's the same thing that you see in our culture, where they're accusing people of certain things. They got caught in certain things, and so they go on the attack and accuse the other party or the other group of the very things that they're guilty of. And so then the next stage is realization, of course, once they realize, well, that's not going to work, because when the 16-year-old girl realizes the parents aren't buying it, then what she does is then she goes into pout mode. So she starts screaming, or not screaming, but she starts crying uncontrollably and how they hate her and this and that. And that's in order to gain the sympathy, to soften them to agree with her. And it's the same thing we see, that goes on sometimes in this, which doesn't work. And so then once that works for the parents, I'm not buying that either. We're not buying your crocodile tears over these things. You see the same thing in politicians happening all the time, especially in communist situations. Then at a certain point, then the 16-year-old girl just yells out, fine. And then she storms off and goes to her room. So then she's like, I'm going to take my marbles and go home. I'm not playing this game with you. It's that same kind of a thing. The only difference, though, between the 16-year-old girl who storms off to her room and pouts, the difference between that and communists is, and it's the same thing that you'll see with demons, certain demons, they would rather burn the country to the ground rather than pout or admit they're wrong. Another thing that you'll see demons actually try and do is dumb people down by jading their perception so they don't see reality precisely and things of that sort, or giving them false impressions or understandings of certain things. And this is something that you see even among communists, is that they're constantly trying to dumb people down in order to control them, the same reason that demons do it. But if you get somebody who's bright and smart, then that doesn't buy it and can actually see it for what it is, then demons kind of go into the same kind of a thing. It's thought policing. So if you don't buy their argument, then what they'll do is they'll kind of attack you like, what kind of a person doesn't believe this? Or what kind of a person doesn't do this, right? Or they'll punish you for actually thinking the good thing or praying when you're supposed to. Communists do the same thing. What they do is that if they can't persuade you and they can't, and in the process of trying to dumb you down, it doesn't work, then what they do is they go into thought police mode. Well, then we're going to punish you for thinking the right thing. One of the things that we have noticed as exorcists is that demons very often do running commentary. So, for example, if they put something in your mind and then you try and try and oppose it in some way, like, no, that's not true, then what they do is they'll make a comment about that, etc. And so, a lot of times they'll even use good things in order to try and take you out, or they'll try and use the opposite argument in order to take you out. So, for example, with scrupulosity, what demons are doing is the person wants to be morally upright, and so they'll use that morally upright and drive it to extremes or control that desire for moral uprightness in order to get you over-obsessing or thinking about something in a way that you normally shouldn't. It's not healthy for you psychologically or spiritually. In a very similar way, you see the same thing among communists in this sense. Communists will often have controlled opposition. So it looks like that communists are not the full people in charge, but in point fact, their opposition is just being controlled for them. And they'll allow their opposition to grandstand, even criticize or say certain things in order to give people the impression that, hey, there is somebody who's fighting against the communists, there's somebody who's fighting against this. But if you pay close attention, that opposition never does anything. So, for example, this is my own opinion, and I leave it purely at that level. But in this country, one of the fundamental problems that we're seeing is that there's one party that is basically in control, and then the other party looks like it's opposing it, and then so they'll catch the other party in something. Right, and then what they do is the other party that has caught the one party in something, they'll say, we're going to do an investigation, but in the end nothing happens. In fact, I've gotten to the point where when I hear they're going to do an investigation, all that means is it's a way to tell people we're taking care of it, don't pay attention to it. Right, and in the end, nothing ever ends up happening, and so this is something that is at the end. Part of it is that in order to keep the evidence out of the public sector, we're doing an investigation, we can't talk about that. Things of this sort. This is one of the things that you see in relationship to demons. They want to control all sides of the equation. You see the same thing among communists. one of the things that we have as human beings is a natural inclination to look at somebody, and if they emotionally break down, then what we recognize just as it's part of our third category of natural inclination that's proper to reason, is that when we see someone emotionally break down, we recognize that reason isn't in control, and so the person's judgments are compromised, and so we suspend judgment about what they're saying until they kind of get their act together, right? Now, in relationship to the diabolic, the demons very often know that we are not going to listen to people that might have diabolic influence because they're emotionally breaking down. Now, we still have to get them to be rational, right? But a lot of times, demons will keep people emotionally prostrate or kind of out of control, precisely sometimes to keep the exorcist from paying much attention to it. Because it's something that men particularly will behave in that way, where they're just not going to pay attention if the particular individual is emotional. But when it comes to communists, what you'll see is it's a slightly different kind of a thing. It's okay for them to have emotional outbursts and meltdowns, and we are required to pay attention, although demons try and get you to pay attention to the person's emotional outburst, to get you sucked in through either compassion or to address the issue or get angry or something like that. But it's okay for communists to have these emotional outbursts and breakdowns as long as it supports communism. Whereas if it doesn't, then you're not permitted to do that. There's obviously something wrong with you. And you're considered as evil and dangerous, right? But it's okay if they actually do it. So, but this is a failure to recognize that we have a natural inclination to realize, they're emotionally breaking down, or they're not acting rationally. They're acting violently or angrily or things like that. If they're by emotional outbursts and meltdowns, I'm not talking about just about crying and carrying on like that. It can be anger or going to extremes in angers. And we have a natural inclination to just kind of retract and say, look, any movement or anything that pushes things out of anger, people just have a certain amount of distrust for it, and they're just less likely to do it, and we're likely to dismiss it as being as incredible, right? Incredible. We're just not going to believe it. And so this is something that is very important for us to recognize, though, is that one of the signs that the communists have gained the upper hand in the power structure is it's okay for them to have these moral or these emotional breakdowns, but if we don't accept them, then they're going to go after us as a result of it. One time during a session, I told some demon that he had to betray somebody that he had control over and that he was using to manipulate them, and that he was using to cause damage to other people. And I told him, you have to betray him, you have to cut him loose. And he just looked at me when I told him he had to betray him. He said, I will, just not now. Well, one of the things that you see with communists is, and this is one of the dangers in communist systems, it's the middle tier people that are at the most dangerous. So if you look at what Stalin did and what these other people do, once they get into position of power, they wipe out or destroy that middle tier of people. And the reason they do that is because those are the people that are most likely to be able to unseat them. And so they have to kill them and wipe them out. And so they betray them. It's ironically because those are the people that very often have been the biggest supporters of this person in their rise to communist power. And so you see the same kind of thing with demons. They'll use lower level people, or they'll use anybody in this life who they consider lower than us to get to a certain point. But in the end, if it gets bad, they'll just wipe them out and betray them. Another sign of communism is that they will allow the controlled opposition to reign for a little while as a form of a release valve. So sometimes, this is very similar to the demons, sometimes the demons will kind of back off and let the person kind of function for a little while in order to kind of be a relief valve, because if it goes on too long, then someone's going to step in and intervene. Well, it's the same kind of a thing with communists. They'll allow the controlled opposition to reign for a while. Of course, the controlled opposition doesn't really do anything during that time frame, but they'll allow them to reign for a little while in order to get the pressure off just a little bit, and then they're right back to doing their things in the next election cycle. I somewhat talked about this in a prior segment in this video, but one of the points that I've noticed among communists, and you see this with demons, is they will often propose something as a reason why something should be done, but it's never a sufficient reason for actually doing that, right? So it's one of those things that you have to keep an eye out for that they suggest something, and it might be true to some degree, but it just doesn't rise to the level as to why we should stop doing that. So, for example, they'll say we have to get rid of all cars because there's this global climate change. Well, the global climate change, at least from my research, doesn't seem to give an indicator that it's sufficiently bad enough at this point to basically be completely overhauling our entire economies worldwide, right? It doesn't mean that we shouldn't take a close look at those things to see what impact human beings could be having, if they're having any at all. I'm not a scientist, I'm just saying. But there is always a lack of sufficient reason that whenever they give the reason, it's not a sufficient reason for why it should actually be done. Now, one of the things that will very often happen is they'll take things that everybody knows by common sense, and then they'll give a reason that's contrary to sufficient reason in order to get it stopped. So, for example, they'll start telling farmers, stop farming. Because what you're doing is, or this particular kind of farming or ranching or having a lot of cattle is, they're producing too much methane, and so as a result, we have to stop that, and it's causing this ecological damage, and so we have to stop, eating meat and things of this sort. So it's never a proportionate reason that you'll give this, and this is the same behavior that you'll see among demons. They'll tell you need to stop doing something, or they'll even suggest you need to do something, but the reason they're giving for it is never a sufficient reason or proportionate to why that should be the case. They always appear to be reasonable in their suggestion, but in the end, if you pay close attention to this lack of sufficient reason, whenever they're giving you a reason or whenever it seems reasonable, if you pay close attention underneath it, it's just masked malice. One of the things that you notice when there's more than one demon possessing somebody, the higher demons don't want the lower demons to have anything, right? They want it all for themselves. And it's okay for them to have these things, but not the lower people, or not the lower demons, I should say. You see this among communists themselves, and you see this even among the world elite. It's okay for them to be jet-setting over the planet and pumping out all sorts of carbon in doing so. But it's not okay for you to basically be able to get in your car and drive down to the supermarket. One of the signs that communists have gotten into the church, there's all sorts of talk about that, but it seems like the mindset of some of the people in the church is very communistic, is the sign of the fact that they've promised the moon over the last 50 to 60 years. As I mentioned before, communists always promise you things, and then in the end you end up with nothing. And we see that in the church the same thing has happened. We were promised the moon, but by every measurable metric, there is not a single place in the church where things have improved except for conversions in Africa. We've ended up, it's slowly getting to the point where our quality of our spiritual lives is deteriorating. And if we're not careful, we'll end up with nothing. Although the church is never going to fully go out of existence. My basic point, though, is that we're seeing that same kind of a thing in the church. Demons want a unified currency so that when the Antichrist comes, it will be easier to control everybody through that unified currency. And so do the communists, because it pools the power in smaller groups of people, and therefore they become more manageable. Once the angels made their choice, some of them made an evil choice and as a result became demons. And once they became demons, then they lost their state of grace. They lost their love of God, or they lost their ability to love God. They lost, even though they're still inclined to doing so, they lost their relationships that they had with each other. Now they hate each other and they feel isolated from each other. All those things, when they lost everything, the only thing left in hell was the power structure. right? So it was always about, anytime you deal with demons in session or, it's always about power. Everything they're trying to do in relationship to us is to gain power over us. With communists, it's all about power. Because the word culture comes from the word cult, or cultus in Latin, which means worship, normally speaking, philosophers have noticed that over the course of history, the particular culture a society had was predominantly controlled by their cult, that is, their form of worship, and then that would infiltrate the rest of the culture and society. And so one of the things that you'll notice among demons is that they always attack the cultists of the society, but they ultimately want to destroy culture. And the reason they want to destroy culture is because culture could be defined as a set of societal habits in relationship to certain kinds of customs. But also it can include, the monuments and the things that are achieved physically, the great buildings and things of that sort, can kind of somewhat define a culture to some degree. Okay, demons are always kind of tearing that down because the culture forms the people, and if you have a strong culture, even if they attack somebody, the person can use the culture to kind of stabilize themselves and to remain faithful by being around other people in the culture. Whereas if you destroy the culture, make it really evil, then it makes it extremely difficult for good people within an evil culture to remain good. And this is why demons are always trying to seek to destroy culture. In other words, destroying culture is just another way to basically gain more power over people. Communism, if you look at it historically, has been the destroyer of cultures. So that the good of each culture has always been replaced by a gray, ugly substitute, an evil substitute. And it's ugly because the architecture changes, the music changes, everything changes to where it doesn't have the same beauty and resilience as a good culture has. And so just like how demons want to destroy culture, communists always destroy culture. Another thing that you'll see with demons is kind of a sophistry. Now, the definition of sophistry, according to Socrates, which I think is actually true, or Plato, is actually true, which is making the lesser argument seem the greater. So in other words, the argument that they have isn't as good of an argument, and it's not very persuasive, and it's not very good, but they present it in such a way, and they force it in such a way that it seems like it's the better argument. Right? And so we see this constantly happening within our own culture right now. Now, demons are always doing that because they're always making, when they put perspectives in our in our images and our imagination, they're always making things look better than they actually are, right? So they're making that lesser argument, or that thing that is lesser, appear greater than it actually is, right? And this is always the nature of temptation. It is always making the thing look better than it actually is. But communism does the same thing. And you see this once it gets into a culture, because it can't persuade, it uses argumentation, because they know that people have to be given some kind of an argument. They'll use argumentation that isn't as good, or it's a lesser argument, or it's not even a sound argument, but they'll use the lesser argument, but present it in such a way that if you don't accept that, there's something wrong with you, that you don't see that this is the better argument, and things of that sort. So in the exact same way that demons make the lesser argument seem like the greater argument, so communists make the lesser arguments, or the those that are not as persuasive, they try and make them seem more persuasive. And in that sense, they're the same. God bless you, and Mary love you. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et manet semper. Amen.